Provincial leaders wrapped up their annual meeting today with a message to the federal government to stay out of their affairs. No one expressed that more bluntly than Ontario Premier Doug Ford.
Like, something's broken. They're wasting taxpayers' money. Go through the provinces, and you know what happens? The premiers get pissed. Simple as that. And they jump in there, and they think they know better.
Despite that, the premiers did weigh in on federal responsibilities. They say Ottawa must meet the NATO defence spending target as soon as possible. Sean Fraser is the Federal Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, and he joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have some angry and frustrated premiers not too far away from where you are. In Halifax, they criticize the federal government's encroachment in their jurisdictions without adequate consultation or collaboration. How are you going to respond to that?
Look, I spend a lot of my time when I'm home in this constituency and visiting communities across Canada, talking with ordinary people. And never once have I been asked to pick fights with another level of government or with a different political party. People don't want politicians to pick fights with one another. They want us to work together to solve problems. I never knew that it was controversial when we invest tens of billions of new spending in healthcare to insist that it goes to things like family doctors and mental health. I never understood the objection to investing in housing during a housing crisis to make sure that we're supporting cities who are actually making it easier to build homes. And when it comes to education, again, a provincial responsibility technically, I can't wrap my head around the objection to making sure that kids go to school on a full stomach. We don't want to pick fights. We want to be at the table to help solve problems. My hope is the premiers see a willing partner, despite their recent interventions at the Council of the Federation, indicating that they seemingly don't want us to be a part of these conversations.
Okay, a lot of premiers brought up school lunch, and I don't think they are ideologically opposed to feeding needy students. But they made the point that it's the process under which it was done, that it was kind of sprung on them in a budget with no real consultation on how to build the plan. And even on things that you're doing like pharmacare and dental care, they're worried about what happens in 5 years if you or a future federal government decides they're not going to fund these things, and they're left with all of this infrastructure in place and without the money to support it.
And look, I agree with you. I don't mean to suggest that provinces don't believe that kids should have a full stomach. In fact, in my home province, I want to applaud the provincial government's efforts to actually advance work in this particular space. But this is something that should not come as a surprise. This is something that we campaigned on. It's something that was a subject of a lot of public conversation, and it's something that we've decided to take action on. When we're putting money on the table, if provinces don't want to be a part of that initiative, they're free to tell us that that's not something that they want our help with. However, the money is there, and my advice to them is that they should work with us to develop this program. We're going to have to work together, particularly if it's delivered in the school system. Again, the argument that you've raised when it comes to things like pharmacare or dental care, to me, it rings hollow. That's the kind of argument that I expect would be advanced by people who want to resist progress. It's true of any specific policy area that what one government does, some future government may undo. But if we fall victim to that analysis, we're going to find ourselves 10 years from now not achieving any progress. I always want to be on the side of people who are trying to do big things, solve big problems, and most importantly, help the people that we've been elected to represent. People don't live their lives in provincial and federal jurisdiction, but they expect those elected officials who serve in one chamber or the other to work together to help improve their quality of life in every community across the country.
Okay, so Premier Newsom, who we spoke to earlier, said that none of your federal programs can work without the provinces getting involved. He's talking specifically about transit for municipalities, housing for municipalities, and they want to be in on those things at the front end rather than midway through the process, because the argument coming from the Premier's table is that it runs the risk of creating duplication with programs that already exist in various jurisdictions across the country, or maybe failing to delivery because it's not calibrated precisely enough for the specifics of a province. What's your response to that?
Look, first of all, hi, Tim. He's a neighbor. We work well together. We're from the same part of Nova Scotia. We've served the same constituents for a number of years. But let's take transit as an example. We made the announcement today about the largest investment in public transit in Canada's history. Within a few hours, I was actually on a call with the provincial minister here in Nova Scotia to discuss some of the work that they'd been doing. And their message to me was, to date, there's been extraordinary collaboration between my office, between our department and their agency agency who's actually developing a plan that will be built by Nova Scotia for Nova Scotia, but supported by the federal government. Anyone listening into that conversation would view that to be a model of how the process ought to work. When it comes to housing, one of my frustrations that I've experienced over the last couple of years is that the reason that we needed to incentivize changes at a municipal level is because those changes were not being made. Provincial governments actually have the legislative authority to make some of those changes without the significant public spend that we've had to put on the table to incentivize cities and communities of different sizes to make it easier and faster to build homes. We want to work collaboratively, but Canadians will be impatient if we let perfection be the enemy of progress. We need to get down to work to make sure we're advancing the priorities that people raise with us. These deals and ideas are not dreamed up behind closed doors on Parliament Hill.
Right.
They come from doorstep conversations with people in communities, and we want to make sure that we're meeting their priorities.
Okay, I do want to touch on housing, but I do want to ask you about this public transit announcement, which your government is billing as the largest public transit investment in Canadian history. And this release, dated July 17th, 2024, the Prime Minister announces the launch of the Canada Public Transit Fund, a new $30 billion investment over the first 10 years, and talks about $3 billion per year in stable funding. But I've gotten an announcement from the same Prime Minister from February of 2021, which talks about $3 billion per year for public transit to communities beginning in 2026, 2027. Isn't this the same thing that was announced 3.5 years ago? They're both not starting until 2026. It looks word for word, dollar for dollar like the same program.
Oh, so easy point of clarity for you, David. The program opened today for the expressions of interest that can actually be submitted to tap into that investment. So this is the transit funding that we had budgeted a few federal budgets ago that is now open for applications for expressions of interest from the metro regions across Canada who are eligible for that same fund. So to answer your question directly, it's the same fund and it's now been opened.
Okay, so but it's 3.5 years from announcement to the ability to apply for it. I mean, is that quick enough for something with the urgent requirements of public transit, which is a big part of your green agenda and a crying need in municipalities?
So one of the things that's important to understand is this is not the beginning of the federal government's investment in transit systems. Mm-hmm. Previously, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan had a significant chapter dedicated to public transit. During those past few years, after the initial money was budgeted for this new transit fund, the former version of the transit support from the federal government was rolling out. There are projects that have been announced more recently over the past few years that are still receiving funding. What you see today is the opening of the next phase of public transit, so that there's that continuous, long-term, predictable source of funding for transit systems across Canada. So despite the fact it may have been budgeted for a few years ago, there has been a stream of public transit money that's been going to support transit organizations before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and since through previous programs. But it's important that we follow the proper budgetary process to actually get the authority to advance these programs through a federal budget and then release it as one program comes near its end to have something more substantial to carry us forward.
Okay, I gotcha, and I appreciate that clarification. Okay, so on housing, this is something that you have been tasked with at the federal level of transforming for reasons of national interest, but also political interest because of the way it's become such a political issue. This is something that constitutionally the premiers are supposed to deal with. They basically delivered a message to your government to stay in your lane, essentially how it's been described at their meetings this week, but then they also weighed in on international trade. They weighed in on the speed of your defense spending and urged you to accelerate hitting the NATO target. What do you make of this seeming contradiction in position that they are saying respect jurisdiction while telling you what to do, while you're saying you're barging into their jurisdiction on issues like housing because they fundamentally require action?
So I don't mind if others give commentary about areas of federal jurisdiction, despite the fact that they may not be elected to the federal parliament. And in fact, I find when you're dealing with elected representatives who talk to people who, again, live in communities, not in jurisdictional silos, that feedback can be very important and very welcome. But you're right, there's a heavy dose of irony that comes with it when in one breath we're told not to make investments in housing unilaterally, but in the next breath there's advice specifically on what we should do in areas of federal concern. It doesn't bother me though. My sense is when we have these conversations, we can actually achieve a greater degree of progress. I think people are sick and tired of politicians who spend their time and energy fighting with one another, and I don't mean to suggest that's all that we do or that the premiers do. We've had great success working with Quebec to make one of the most significant investments in social housing with a $1.8 billion deal, a $2 billion deal with the province of British Columbia, who's been an absolute leader when it comes to housing. We've got opportunities that I've had personally to work with Scott Moe when it came to welcoming Ukrainians. We've got more and more examples we can point to, including the transit conversation I had with the Nova Scotia minister today. My goal right now is to focus on the problems that people raise with me in my community and across Canada. Sometimes that requires provincial cooperation. Other times we can act unilaterally. So if the provincial governments have feedback on areas of federal jurisdiction, I welcome it. I hope that they would demonstrate the professional courtesy to accept our help when we're trying to solve very big problems that may touch on their areas of competence as well.
The Prime Minister's office has released a letter responding to the Premier's concerns, suggesting that Dominic LeBlanc will set up a meeting with Premier Ford, who takes over as the new chair of the Premier's Council, and any other interested premiers. Shouldn't the Prime Minister be meeting with the First Ministers to talk about some of these issues? That feels like a Prime Minister to Premier conversation that needs to happen in this country.
The Prime Minister is engaged with the premiers on a number of occasions, but don't forget that Dominic is also the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. He's got great relationships, not just with Premier Ford, but with premiers and provincial representatives across the country.
But with respect to Minister LeBlanc, they do want to meet with the Prime Minister. I know a lot of people want to meet with the Prime Minister, but these are the premiers, and they've been asking for a meeting for close to a year, or if not over a year.
Certainly, and I find sometimes before you have a clear idea of what agenda items you're seeking to complete and to secure a deal on, you don't want to engage in creating expectations where that there's going to be some opportunity to make a deal when in fact there's no chance at real progress. When I see the tone coming out of the Council of the Federation today, my sense is the premiers wanted to score a political point by announcing that they don't like Ottawa doing certain things. If we get to a point where we need to negotiate the final portions of a deal on a given issue, whether it's healthcare, whether it's housing, whether it's the school food program, or whatever other issue you may see them discuss, I think there will come a time where it's essential for the Prime Minister to engage personally. But at this stage, when it seems that there's a lot of preliminary details to be worked out, it's an excellent idea to have a designated representative to deal specifically with intergovernmental affairs. And given the relationships and competence of my friend and colleague, Mr. LeBlanc, it's clear to me he's very well positioned to serve in that capacity. Okay,
I have one last question for you because I've gone over time. But what about inter-caucus affairs? You've seen the calls and the questions about the Prime Minister's leadership since the by-election loss. There's not going to be a full caucus meeting, but there are one-on-one reach-outs and group reach-outs happening. How would you describe the mood inside your caucus at this point in the summer?
My sense is most people that I work alongside are focused on the needs of the people that live in their communities. I've never once received questions about who sits in what chair. I find it sometimes elected officials can be arrogant that they think that's what's on people's minds at home. My colleagues that I've had conversations with over the past couple of weeks have been talking about what they're actually hearing from people at home. People are focused on things like the cost of living, whether they get a job to put food on the table, protecting our environment, making sure that there's enough houses for people to live in, and healthcare. If we remain focused on what people are focused on, we would do ourselves a great service as compared to focusing on what jobs politicians have instead of what jobs our constituents have.
Housing Minister Sean Fraser, always appreciate the time, sir. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
Like something's broken. They're wasting taxpayers' money. Go through the provinces.
There's implications to these quick decisions you've made, and they're going to affect our economy.
We can't keep cutting our own sources of revenue because the federal government refuses to cut theirs.
We're all kind of bursting at the seams in relation to keeping up with housing. We're getting the pushback from many citizens about the cost and the affordability. And
you know what happens? The premiers get pissed.
Okay, the premiers are clear, but the federal government says Canadians don't want to see different levels of government bickering all the time.
People don't want politicians to pick fights with one another. They want us to work together to solve problems. When we're putting money on the table, if provinces don't want to be a part of that initiative, they're free to tell us that that's not something that they want our help with.
Okay, so does anyone come out ahead in these disputes other than journalists and political shows in the summer? We're going to talk about all of this with the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist. Jordan Leiknitz is a former NDP strategist. And Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. All right, don't be alarmed, but the premiers are mad, right? It's summer. Amanda, though, do they not have a point that the federal government is sometimes springing things on them that requires them to come in with money or with responsibility without being consulted at the front end of things, the way it's gone the last little while?
Well, okay, I think a couple of things. I think that, the premiers are in the enviable position of being able to pit the federal government as the foe. So if they want to play the blame game, this is a good opportunity to do it, and they can stand arm in arm. I think ideally, of course, everyone would like to see more of a kumbaya, coming together to get the job done. But the federal government is also, they're in their last year of this mandate. They have to get this job done. They have things like dental care and pharmacare and childcare that, of course, requires the cooperation of the provinces, but they've also made these promises to Canadians. So it's kind of like they're in the position of, well, either the provinces are going to get on board and on side, and if they're not, then they need to get out of the way, because certainly the federal government doesn't want to be in a position that they're being accused of dithering, or that there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And we know that they've had that criticism in the past. So in a year where you're heading into the next election, I think it's more important for them to be seen by the Canadian public as the advocate, as the person who's going to get the job done. And if that means premiers get out of the way, that's what it means.
So Tim, it's just a collision of political necessity with constitutional jurisdiction? I mean, the premiers had a lot to say about defense spending and international trade and all kinds of things that aren't their job today. It was interesting.
Normally it's all of that, just your summer brouhaha provinces are always mad at the feds. That's not new. I think the new dynamic is this, that Justin Trudeau, for good or for bad, is seen to be very toxic. So every premier is running away from him at the moment because that's providing good politics for them at home. We've seen that from Newfoundland to BC. That is happening. The other dynamic...
Specifically, the two of them sitting together today.
Exactly,
on equalization.
Some things bring the premiers together.
But also you have probably a little bit of, if Doug Ford was talking about pissing people off, there was a little sucking up going on. And it wasn't sucking up to Justin Trudeau, it was to Poilievre, right? I think all of them are looking at the same polls we are. None of them, again, because he is toxic, Trudeau is, want to be seen to be in line with him right now. They know in their minds, they probably think Pierre Poilievre keeps a list of who's being good and who's being bad, so nobody's going out on a limb to support them. A lot of the messages the premiers are giving are exact same messages that Poilievre is giving, so no surprise around all of those positions. I will say this interesting about getting programs completed. Amanda's point, you do see the difference in the dynamic because the federal government, when they brought in childcare, after years and years and years and years, and we've talked about that on this panel very often, were able to eventually get everybody on board. But what was different then? Justin Trudeau's check also came with political capital. Right now, there's no political capital, or the political capital that was there before.
Well, there's also, widespread public support for the idea there's an economic value in investing in $10 a day child care, right? That there's Jordan.
That was part of the political capital, I would say, that he had at the time that didn't exist before.
It's interesting, though, Jordan, and I've asked three premiers about this, because the line that jumps out at me in the communique is, our federation works best when all orders of government respect constitutional authority. And I asked them how they square that with Scott Moe not collecting and remitting the carbon tax. I was like, well, you're going to have to ask Scott, even though they had 2 days of meetings with him. But what do you make of this? Stop doing things in our areas, but we want you to do these things in your areas because it's in our best interest dynamic.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's shocking, but I think it's political.
Okay.
This is really just about they're each playing to their audiences here, and I think you see that really across the country, as Tim was saying. And the difference, I think that we saw early on, on the childcare as an example, is that there Trudeau had time, right? It wasn't just the political capital; he also had time to go and close the deal one by one with the provinces. And you saw this also with healthcare spending, where you had really, for example, strong criticism from Ontario and the Ford government early on, and then very quiet acquiescence and signing on a few months down the road. So typically when the federal government comes in with a lot of money that's additional in these programs, people find their way around their feelings eventually, and figure out a way to take that money in order to then deliver on their own election commitments to their constituents. Like, that's just smart politics for everybody involved. I think the difference right now is that time is just very compressed, right? So you have, of course, BC is heading into an election this fall. Saskatchewan is in an election. You've got, you really are feeling the pressure in a number of provinces. And of course, time is very short in the federal scene and things feel pretty dire. So there's not necessarily that same room to maneuver for the federal government. And they always end up as the easy punching bag here.
Okay, and the U.S. is also heading into an election. And this is why I saw a lot of premiers talking about NATO targets and this pace of we just got a commitment of 2032, and now the premiers are saying you need to go faster, which is not sort of thing that normally comes up at a summer meeting of the premiers, but they're worried about change in the U.S. and what a Trump-Vance, it's very different, same still different thing, might do. So
just saving on those signs.
We have an interview coming up with Danielle Smith that I taped earlier, and I asked her about this. It's like, okay, you want the Liberal government to hit 2%. What about a possible future Conservative government? Because they've said they don't necessarily believe in hitting that target. Here's what Danielle Smith had to say.
We don't want that relationship to be strained because the federal government in the U.S. retaliates against us because we're not meeting that military target. We're just trying to be proactive here, and absolutely, we will put the same pressure on the opposition leader if he also becomes prime minister.
So, Amanda, that's interesting. A lot of people were writing the current government and saying you got to get to 2% or we're going to be diplomatically and politically isolated. And Pierre Poilievre said he wouldn't do it. Now, Danielle Smith, a pretty prominent Conservative and a supporter of him, says they should commit to it and they should do it. It's in the national interest. What do you think?
Well, I think Danielle Smith's brand is about really standing up for the things that she believes in. And if she's seen to acquiesce even before somebody's in government, I think that would be a very strange position for her to take. This is her position. And be damned, whoever is leading the country. So that wasn't surprising to me. What was a little surprising, though, was the Premier's position on timeline. So we saw a Manitoba Premier say, it should be done in 4 years, not 6 years. And you can understand that, obviously, with the American election, there's going to be an emphasis on how to maintain this trade relationship. How do we have the best possible international relationships? But certainly, how do we keep our Canada-U.S. relationship at a prime? So they're feeding into what will be in the news and what will be in the zeitgeist. But with this commitment being made by the federal government only a week ago for 2032, it was a little odd to me that we saw this emphasis or this push for this 4-year commitment as if those 2 years would be a make or break.
Right. Well, it's interesting, Tim, that they say the Fed should stay in their lane because they don't understand the nuances of things in the provincial level. Defense procurement's a whole other thing. I don't know if you could accelerate $20-odd billion a year at that pace, but Poilievre said he won't hit 2%. Now, the Conservative Premier of Alberta, who wants him to be the Prime Minister, says he should hit 2%. What does that do to that conversation?
Makes it fun and interesting, David. Look, I think of the things Pierre Poilievre is worried about as it relates to his potential chances of getting elected. He's probably already got the safety and security crowd, and he will probably have a fairly ambitious agenda, I suspect, about investment in the military. So it's not a political vulnerability for him domestically. What I find interesting about the Premier's comments, they're also sucking up. Maybe that's the theme of the meeting, and it has nothing to do with the Prime Minister. I mean, on two fronts. One, the trade between each province and the United States is, I think, it's the most significant trading partner for each province.
Yeah.
I would be shocked if that's not the case. So it makes just good sense. If Trump is going to win, you know what he's like, you know where he's going to go. You speak of somebody who keeps lists, he keeps lists. Secondarily, from an economic development perspective, 2%, getting to 2% faster is going to be probably very good for a lot of provinces who saw their national defense capacities diminished over the years. I mean, you look at our region in Atlantic Canada, we used to have a ton of national defense investment. Alberta, air bases, Manitoba, Wapcanoe, same thing. It's a no-brainer for them to say this because it doesn't cut into their pot of money, and it perhaps, arguably, creates some economic investment in their communities if you accelerate the path to 2% more quickly.
Jordan, what do you make of the defense stuff and any other final thoughts on what's happening here?
Yeah, so I think this is so much about what's happening in the U.S. and the nervousness, I think, is really justified. The reality is that Trump is volatile. We don't know what he's going to do, and what he said he's going to do is alarming with respect to the trade relationship and potentially pulling out of NATO or not defending countries within NATO. So I think the nervousness is warranted. Where I'm not sure there's going to be as much of a wedge is on the timeline versus no timeline, because the reality is 2032 is far enough out that we're not going to be meeting that target within, for example, the next Trump presidency. So the difference between having a target that we're not meeting and having a target that we don't have a timeline for is pretty slight in the next 4 years. I do think that there are ways, and Premier Eby talked about this as well. There are ways that the federal government can be a little bit more creative in the accounting in terms of what counts towards military spending. And you see European allies doing this. So for example, in Belgium, the rail system, because they use it to transport things to the front line in Ukraine, that counts towards their defense spending. So you could look at sort of similar things here, particularly in Canada, where our military investment encompasses so many other aspects of protecting people at home, like emergency response, wildfires, things like that. So I would expect to see some of that work happening and maybe bringing us a little bit closer to that goal as we go on.
So Amanda, the federal-provincial relationship has been a bit rough now for a while, so we say. There was a response to some of this today from the Prime Minister's office saying they're going to get Dominic LeBlanc, the Minister of Janitorial and Intergovernmental Affairs, because he cleans up everything for them, to reach out to Doug Ford and other premiers who want to have a meeting to set up a meeting, but still no First Minister's meeting, which is something Tim Houston and the premiers have wanted forever. I mean, at some point, don't all of these people need to sit down together and deal with all the things that they have in common and not in common?
But do they? I mean, I think, yes, in a perfect world, yes, but it's a little bit of a utopian view of what would happen in that meeting. And I think that the federal government recognizes that the strained relationship that has occurred means that they have to, and I'll go back to earlier comments, they have to push their agenda through. They have to be seen by Canadians to getting the job done, premiers be damned. And I think that getting in a room probably just ends up resulting in, a lot of blame pushing, a lot of, issues on the table, a lot of grievances being aired, but does it actually result in progress? So I think that they put people in the window to say, listen, here's the person who's going to be our connecting voice, and here's somebody who's going to try to help push these issues forward. But the Prime Minister himself, I think him staying a little further back and being able to talk directly to Canadians versus being seen to be in a room where people don't like his agenda is the right move at this moment.
Okay, Tim, what do you think?
Should
he do it or not?
Should get whoever's producing tonight should dig up a tape circa me 2013-14 saying exactly the same thing about why Stephen Harper didn't like First Minister's meeting.
Yeah. They're always great when you're brand new.
Yeah,
right?
they're one. But I mean, and this Prime Minister was going to have more of them. He did, to be fair to him, during the whole COVID period. Yeah. But look, it's like having a caucus meeting for him now. If he has a caucus meeting, if he has a First Minister's meeting, maybe even his cabinet meeting Friday, it's not going to be a fun experience for him. And if you're Justin Trudeau and you're trying to save your regime and plot your way forward, I get why you don't want to have one. But at the same vein, you've just opened yourself up for more unhelpful criticism at this juncture.
Okay, Jordan, last word to you.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely no reason for the Prime Minister to want to go into one of those meetings and be a piñata. And that's what it would be. They're making the bet that Canadians care less about jurisdiction and more about the services that are being delivered and what's happening in their day-to-day lives, and that they could just wait this one out and eventually it'll blow over. And
the IMF is projecting this will be the hottest economy in the G7 next year. So, the hope springs eternal for the turnaround that they've been counting on. So who knows? All right, I want to thank you all for being here in the summer. Jordan Likeness, Tim Powers, and Amanda Alvaro. Thank you to the Power Panel.